Have you ever done everything right and still lost? Not because you were less talented, not because you worked less hard, not because your idea was worse or your intentions were less pure. You did everything the way you were taught. You were honest, you were direct, you shared credit, you worked hard and assumed the work would speak for itself, and then someone else, who worked less hard, who was less talented, who you privately knew was less capable, got the promotion, got the credit, got the room, got the outcome you had earned. And you stood there genuinely confused, because by every rule you had been given, you should have won. That moment, that specific confusion, points to a very uncomfortable truth about how human hierarchies actually function in the real world, as opposed to how we were taught they function back in grade school. So today we are taking a deep dive into a highly polarizing map of human behavior. One that suggests if you ever found yourself in that exact scenario, staring at a loss you didn't deserve, you were playing by rules that were never the actual rules. To truly understand the architecture of this unseen game, we have to start with the origin story of the man who codified it. We are going back to Los Angeles, 1996. Picture this, a man named Robert Greene, 35 years old, working as a Hollywood assistant. And if you know anything about the entertainment industry, an assistant is at the absolute bottom of an incredibly steep, ruthless power hierarchy. An industry built entirely on gatekeeping, perception, and power dynamics. He is carrying the coffee while watching the mechanics of power operate from the inside. But Greene hadn't just been a Hollywood assistant. Before this, he had a long, wandering string of jobs: journalist, editor, translator, even a construction worker. He had moved through vastly different social strata and professions, and that diverse background gave him a unique comparative lens. Because whether he was on a gritty construction site or standing in a velvet-lined Hollywood executive suite, Greene kept arriving at the same persistent, deeply uncomfortable realization. The world operates on a set of hidden, unspoken rules, the actual rules. The people who succeeded and dominated their environments were almost never the hardest workers, and they certainly weren't the most virtuous or the most honest. They were the individuals who intuitively understood the mechanics of human behavior, manipulation, managing appearances, indirect action, all of it. So Greene spent years doing something about that realization. He distilled 3,000 years of history, drawing from military strategists like Sun Tzu, political philosophers like Machiavelli, even con artists, courtiers, and absolute monarchs. He gathered those historical patterns into a collection of laws. Now let me be clear with you right up front. We are not exploring this material to turn you into some manipulative supervillain. We are looking at it as a map of the territory. And the territory already exists. You live in it every day. This is about acquiring a vocabulary for the dynamics you have likely been navigating your entire life, but often completely in the dark. The goal is to decode these behaviors so you are never blindsided by a power play again. But before we get into the actual laws, we have to address the giant elephant in the room, because this material has a reputation that wildly precedes it. Based on extensive research into forums and discussions around this book, the polarization is intense. On one side, it is notoriously popular among Wall Street brokers, cutthroat corporate managers, and, as one rather vivid commenter put it, business major gym bros. It found an almost cult-like following among people who operate in highly competitive, zero-sum environments. But on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, it is officially banned in American prison libraries. Think about that for a second. The exact same text considered essential reading in corporate boardrooms is deemed too dangerous to exist inside a correctional facility. And that juxtaposition is one of the most revealing things about this book. Why is it banned? Because a prison is a microcosm of absolute raw hierarchy, stripped of all polite societal fiction. There is no HR department in prison. Power is a literal matter of survival. So the authorities recognize that the psychological mechanisms described in this material are so potent, so devoid of moral constraint, that introducing them into an already volatile enclosed hierarchy is like dropping a match into a powder keg. And the emotional toll of reading it is very real. Research turns up source after source describing readers feeling genuine guilt and disgust. One person literally compared listening to the audiobook to being on the phone with the devil. They called it a playbook for psychopaths. So let me ask the uncomfortable question directly. If this text is a how-to guide for narcissists and manipulators, why should a decent person engage with it? Isn't studying this just polluting your own mind? That is the most common reaction, and honestly the most valid one, when you first encounter this level of cynicism. But here is the critical distinction. This material is descriptive, not prescriptive. It is describing the gravity of human nature. You might not like gravity. You might think gravity is cruel when someone falls off a cliff. But refusing to study gravity out of moral outrage will not stop you from hitting the ground when you step off the ledge. One researcher framed it perfectly. They called it a field guide to assholes by behavior. And the argument is this: if someone is reading this as a daily checklist for their own actions, they are missing the point entirely. Even Greene himself has said that anyone who actually attempted to follow all 48 laws perfectly in their daily life would be the most ugly, disgusting human on earth. No friends, no genuine love, no soul. The author himself is telling you, please do not do this, which means at its core, this is fundamentally a defensive mechanism. If you do not know the game is being played, you are inevitably going to be the pawn. The people who are naturally inclined to trample others, the narcissists, the aggressively ambitious, they are already deploying these tactics instinctively. They do not need a book to tell them how to be ruthless. But the rest of us need the vocabulary to spot the trap before it springs. You are listening to this to recognize when these patterns are being deployed against you. Whether that is a passive-aggressive co-worker in office politics, an overly demanding boss, or the complex dynamics of a personal relationship. You cannot defend against a strategy you cannot see, and ignoring the reality of the game out of a sense of moral superiority does not make the game stop. It merely makes you the easiest target on the board. So with that defensive posture firmly established, let us look at one of the most counterintuitive concepts in the entire historical playbook: the lethal danger of words. Specifically, the law that states, always say less than necessary. This is counterintuitive because in modern corporate and social culture, transparency is treated as the ultimate virtue. We are constantly told to speak our truth, to over-communicate, to bring our whole unfiltered selves to the table, which, when you are operating in a highly competitive or adversarial environment, is a catastrophic liability. The fundamental logic here is fascinating. Humans are wired to over-communicate because it builds tribal bonds. We babble to show we are safe, but in a power dynamic, the more you say, the more common you appear. Words are subject to inflation. If you flood the market with your opinions, the value of your voice plummets. And the more you talk, the higher the probability that you will let slip something utterly foolish, vulnerable, or dangerous. The historical examples of this are brutal. Let us unpack the story of the broken rope. To understand the lethal danger of words, we travel back to St. Petersburg, Russia, the freezing winter of 1825. Tsar Nicholas I has just ascended the throne, and immediately a rebellion breaks out. It is known as the Decembrist Uprising, a group of liberal, forward-thinking military officers demanding modernization and a constitution. Nicholas is an autocrat. He crushes the rebellion with artillery fire right in the town square, and he sentences the key leaders to death by hanging. One of those leaders is a poet and revolutionary named Kondraty Ryleyev. Fast forward to the day of execution. Bitter cold. Ryleyev is standing on the gallows. A heavy hemp noose is placed around his neck. The trapdoor opens. He drops with incredible force. But the rope snaps. He plummets to the muddy ground below, bruised, battered, but very much alive. Now, to understand what happens next, you have to understand the deep superstition embedded in 19th century Russian culture. Events like a snapping hangman's rope were almost universally interpreted as signs of divine providence, the will of heaven intervening. When a man was saved from execution by a mechanical failure like this, it was customary, almost an unspoken law, for the sovereign to grant a full pardon. Ryleyev literally had a second lease on life handed to him. The universe gave him a winning lottery ticket. All he had to do was dust himself off and go home. But Ryleyev, getting to his feet and believing his neck was definitively saved, experiences this massive surge of ego. He cannot resist the urge to have the last word, to show off his defiance to the crowd. He calls out loudly and sarcastically, You see, in Russia, they don't know how to do anything properly, not even how to make rope. A breathless messenger is already rushing through the snow to the Winter Palace to inform the Tsar Nicholas about the failed hanging. The Tsar is annoyed by the incompetence of his executioners, but he knows the historical customs around divine providence. He actually picks up his pen, dips it in ink, and begins to sign the official pardon for Ryleyev. He is actually doing it. But before the pen leaves the paper, he pauses. He looks at the messenger and asks, "Did Ryleyev say anything after this miracle?" The messenger, bound by duty, recounts the exact words. And the psychology of the Tsar in that exact moment is the crux of this whole lesson. His ego had just been directly challenged. Ryleyev didn't just insult the rope makers, he insulted the state and by extension the sovereign himself. Nicholas stops. He looks at the messenger and says, "In that case, let us prove the contrary." He rips the pardon to shreds. The very next day, Ryleyev is marched back up to the gallows, and this time, the rope did not break. A single momentary urge for a sarcastic quip literally cost a man his life. The momentary satisfaction of feeling superior, of getting that laugh from the crowd, was infinitely outweighed by the ultimate price. Once words leave your mouth, they are independent entities. You cannot pull them back. Now contrast Ryleyev's fatal lack of restraint with the immense power of deliberate silence, what the research refers to as the power of the Sphinx. Take King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, his ministers, his nobles, the sharpest political minds in Europe would spend days agonizing over state issues, forming secret alliances, drafting exhaustive documents, trying to anticipate every possible counter-argument just to pitch a single idea to him. It sounds like modern corporate consulting, honestly. They would finally approach the king and deliver these elaborate, passionate presentations laying out the fate of the nation. And after all that build-up, all that rhetorical maneuvering, Louis would listen in total unbroken silence. A completely inscrutable, flat expression, a stone face. And when they finally ran out of breath and begged for his decision, he would simply look at them and say, "I shall see," then turn his back and walk away. 3 words. By saying less than necessary, he retained absolute, terrifying power over every single person in that room. He gave them nothing to react to. They had no idea what he was thinking. They couldn't scheme against his decision. They couldn't flatter him because he hadn't revealed his hand. Silence creates a vacuum, and human beings are psychologically terrified of vacuums. We rush to fill them. When you are silent, people project their own anxieties, their insecurities, their interpretations onto you. It creates an aura of profound meaning and unpredictability. And this exact dynamic plays out in modern settings too, especially in high-stakes negotiations. The research actually highlights a great anecdote about the screenwriter Michael Arlen in 1944. He runs into Louis B. Mayer, the legendary and notoriously cheap head of MGM Studios. Mayer is trying to gauge Arlen's availability, so he asks what his plans are. Arlen vaguely mentions he was just having a conversation with another producer, Sam Goldwyn, dropping names. Mayer, instantly competitive, wants to poach him, so he asks point blank, "How much did he offer you?" He just says, "Not enough." He doesn't say he offered me 50,000, which would allow Mayer to simply offer 51,000. He leaves a blank space. Arlen didn't over-explain his value. He didn't justify his worth with a long list of past successful films. He just gave an open-ended response. And Mayer's own competitive imagination rushed in to fill that gap with a massively higher dollar amount. Mayer instantly offered him a huge, lucrative contract. But that kind of restraint only works when you combine silence with distraction. Silence by itself isn't always enough. Sometimes people will simply ignore a quiet person. To truly direct someone's behavior, you have to actively build a maze for them. Which brings us to the next layer, concealing your intentions. Because if people know what you truly want, you have zero leverage. You give them the time and the target to prepare a defense. It is the poker analogy. If your cards are facing outward for the whole table to see, your ability to bluff is mathematically zero. You have given away the entire game. And the most effective way to conceal your intentions is not to hide in the shadows. The best deception is hiding in plain sight by using a smokescreen. You envelop your true actions in enough comfortable, familiar ambiguity that by the time your opponent realizes what you are actually up to, the trap is already closed. The research breaks down a brilliant historical example of this involving Jay Gould, one of the most ruthless American robber barons of the Gilded Age, and his war against the Western Union telegraph monopoly. This strategy was a masterclass in exploiting the human brain's reliance on pattern recognition. Here is how it works. Our brains consume a lot of energy, so they constantly look for shortcuts. When we see a pattern happen twice, we automatically assume it will happen a third time. It is efficient. Gould starts a small telegraph company that specifically targets Western Union's most profitable routes. The directors of Western Union view him as a nuisance. They buy his company out at a premium just to get rid of him. They think they solved the problem with their wallet. But a few months later, Gould repeats the exact same maneuver. He starts a second competing company. Western Union groans, opens their checkbook, and buys him out again. And here is where the psychology of the smokescreen locks into place. Western Union's board assumed they had Gould figured out. They decided his entire business model was corporate extortion, building annoying little companies to get bought out at a profit. So they relaxed. They felt superior. They thought they understood his limited game. So when Gould begins buying up stock and making moves for a third time, Western Union thinks, here we go again. Prep the buyout paperwork. But they were completely blind to what was actually happening. The first two buyouts were just the smokescreen. Gould suddenly launched a massive, bloody, hostile corporate takeover. He didn't want them to buy his third company. He used the capital and the element of surprise to buy them. He seized complete control of the monopoly. He used the familiar, non-threatening pattern of the first two buyouts to lull his target into a false sense of security. And once a target believes they know exactly what you want, their critical threat detection shuts down. Then you pivot and go for the jugular. It is the exact mechanism of a magician's sleight of hand. A good illusionist doesn't just hide the coin in their palm. They wave something bright and shiny in their other hand. They ask you a question to engage your verbal processing. You hide your true intention behind something the mark expects to see, so they never realize they are being fooled until the trick is done. The smokescreen works because it plays on our deep psychological desire for the world to be predictable. When you feed someone a pattern they expect, you satisfy that desire. And a satisfied, comfortable target is an incredibly docile and vulnerable one. But there is a tension here worth sitting with. We have established that talking too much leaks your power and broadcasting your intentions hands your opponents leverage. But if you are not explaining yourself and not telling people what you want, how do you actually persuade anyone? How do you move the needle? That requires us to look at how we engage in conflict, specifically, winning through your actions, never through argument. The core psychological insight here is one we all know intuitively but constantly forget in the heat of the moment. Arguing with someone almost never changes their mind. Even if you come armed with immaculate data, airtight logic, and a perfect presentation, even if you completely dismantle their argument, the victory is almost always a Pyrrhic one. A Pyrrhic victory, named after King Pyrrhus of Epirus, whose army suffered such irreplaceable casualties defeating the Romans that it effectively destroyed his own campaign. You win the battle, but the emotional cost loses you the war. When you win an argument, particularly in a professional setting, you humiliate the other person. People's beliefs and opinions are deeply intertwined with their egos. When you argue against their idea, their amygdala, the threat processing center of the brain, interprets it as a literal physical attack on their identity. So they fight back like their life depends on it, and you stir up a lingering resentment that lasts far longer than any momentary shift in policy. It is infinitely more powerful and far safer to get someone to agree with you through undeniable physical action without saying a single word of debate. You must demonstrate, not explicate. The research details the story of Victor Lustig to illustrate exactly how a master manipulator uses this understanding in a high-stakes scenario. Lustig was a legendary, almost mythical scam artist in the early 20th century. He ran a very specific con where he sold what he called a money printing box. An elaborate, heavy mahogany box filled with intricate, completely useless gears that he claimed could chemically duplicate $100 bills. And he actually managed to sell one of these boxes to an Oklahoma sheriff for thousands of dollars. Scamming a law enforcement officer is inviting the full weight of the state to hunt you down. Inevitably, the sheriff goes home, turns the crank, and realizes he has bought an expensive piece of wood. He tracks Lustig down to a hotel room in Chicago. The sheriff kicks the door in, pulls a loaded gun, shoves it in Lustig's face, and demands his money back. Furious, adrenaline pumping, ready for violence. Think about what the normal human instinct is in that situation. Most people facing a gun would panic, beg, or instinctively start arguing, saying they didn't scam anyone, trying desperately to talk their way out of the corner. But any verbal reaction would give the sheriff a reason to pull the trigger. It escalates the conflict. It hands your opponent fuel. Lustig has supernatural emotional regulation. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't argue. He calmly looks at the barrel of the gun and feigns mild confusion. He says softly, "Oh, you must not be operating it right." Then he goes into phase 2. He doesn't try to win a debate about the mechanics of the box. He walks over to a drawer, takes out a massive stack of real, verifiable $100 bills, and hands the sheriff every single penny back. Then he gives him a new set of written instructions on how to properly use the machine and pleasantly tells the sheriff to go have a fun, lavish weekend in Chicago on him. It is a stunning display of disarming an opponent through pure action. The sheriff kicked that door down, ready for a fight. His brain was primed for an argument, for resistance. Lustig completely short-circuited that expectation. He gave the sheriff complete, immediate capitulation combined with overwhelming, confusing generosity. The sheriff was so cognitively disoriented by the action that his anger simply evaporated. He put the gun away, took the money, and left without a single act of violence. The action overwhelmed the argument. And here is the kicker. Lustig had given the sheriff a stack of counterfeit bills. A few weeks later, Lustig reads in the newspaper that the Oklahoma sheriff had been arrested and federally convicted for passing fake money. Lustig neutralized a legal threat and won the encounter flawlessly, and he never had to raise his voice once. He understood that action cuts through emotional noise. The physical act of handing over the money completely bypassed the sheriff's rational defenses. Now that strategy is brilliant for handling an adversary coming directly at you. But what about the people above you? The bosses, the primary clients, the people you rely on for your livelihood? That dynamic brings us to Law 11. Learn to keep people dependent on you. The logic here suggests that to truly maintain your independence and security, you must be fundamentally needed. And that requires a profound philosophical shift in how most modern people view freedom. In our culture, we tend to romanticize freedom as utter self-reliance, the lone wolf who needs nobody. But in a complex social or corporate hierarchy, that kind of isolation actually makes you entirely expendable. True, sustainable freedom comes from others needing you so desperately that they cannot afford to cross you. If the person holding power depends on you for their happiness, their prosperity, or their survival, you have nothing to fear from them. The historical illustration of this is almost Shakespearean. It involves King Louis XI of France, known as the Spider King, because he was constantly weaving complex, paranoid webs of alliances. And this story involves his court astrologer. King Louis was deeply, paralyzingly superstitious, but he was also a ruthless pragmatist. He employed a court astrologer who, perhaps seeking to show off, accurately predicted that a specific lady of the court would die within 8 days. And when she did, the king was terrified. He believed the astrologer either had dark demonic powers or had literally murdered her to make his prophecy come true. Either way, the king decided the astrologer was too dangerous to live. So the king sets a trap. He summons the astrologer to his private chambers high in the castle. Armed guards are hidden right outside the door with strict orders. When the king gives a specific signal, they are to burst in, grab the astrologer, and throw him out the window to his death. The astrologer enters the room. The trap is set. But before giving the fatal signal, the king decides to play a cruel psychological game first. He wants to prove the man is a fraud before executing him. He asks the astrologer, "And you claim to understand the heavens and to know the fate of others. So tell me, prophet, what will your own fate be, and exactly how long do you have to live?" It is an impossible paradox. If the astrologer says he will live to be 90, the king gives the signal and kills him instantly, proving his visions were fake. If he says he will die today, he is effectively giving permission for his own execution. But the astrologer, reading the cold tension in the room and realizing he is standing on a trap door, delivers an absolutely brilliant, life-saving answer. He doesn't miss a beat. He looks the king dead in the eye and says, "I shall die just 3 days before your majesty." In a single sentence, the astrologer inextricably linked his own fragile life to the life of the most powerful man in France. The Spider King was so terrified of his own demise that he not only spared the astrologer, he protected him with the full weight of the crown, he lavished him with gold, assigned him personal bodyguards, and had him tended by the finest physicians in Europe. The astrologer ended up surviving the king by several years. He proved his mastery not of reading the stars, but of reading the mechanics of power. He created a scenario where the source of power was entirely, existentially dependent on his continued well-being. But applying this exact logic to a modern workplace feels genuinely problematic. If you are an engineer who deliberately writes convoluted code that no one else can read, or you refuse to train junior staff on a vital process just to become indispensable, doesn't that just make you a toxic, miserable teammate? At what point does intertwining fates just become holding a company hostage? That is a crucial distinction and a very common misinterpretation of this law. The text does not advocate for petty gatekeeping. Hoarding the instruction manual or refusing to share passwords doesn't make you powerful. It makes you a nuisance, and nuisances get fired. Once they become too frustrating, they are eventually removed regardless of the short-term pain it causes the organization. True indispensability is not about artificial bottlenecks. It is about cultivating a unique, highly specialized, genuinely irreplaceable skill. The historical parallel the research uses here is Michelangelo and Pope Julius II. They had a horrific working relationship. They quarreled constantly, threw insults at each other, and Michelangelo even stormed out of Rome in disgust at one point, abandoning his work entirely. But the Pope didn't fire him. He didn't have him arrested. He actively sought Michelangelo out, apologized, and begged him to return. Why? Because the Pope could find 100 wealthy patrons. He could never find another Michelangelo. The research calls this the intertwining of fates. Like creeping ivy, you organically wrap your unique talents around the source of power so that cutting you away would cause immense, irreplaceable damage to the organization itself. You want to be the linchpin, not the troll under the bridge. Now it is one thing to outmaneuver a single person, an angry sheriff, or a superstitious king. It is an entirely different, arguably darker level of psychology to manipulate the masses. Which brings us to some of the most intense material we are covering today. We are moving into how these laws exploit the fundamental flaws in human nature itself. We begin with the deceiver's first commandment, play a sucker to catch a sucker. Or to strip away the historical language, the idea that appearing smarter than your opponent is actually a massive strategic weakness. This concept goes entirely against our modern culture. From the time we are in school, we want to be perceived as brilliant, sharp, capable, and hyper-competent. We post our accolades online. LinkedIn is essentially built on this instinct. But in the mechanics of social dominance, aggressively displaying your brilliance is dangerous. It puts people on guard. It makes them suspicious and competitive. So what is the alternative? If instead you make your opponent feel remarkably smarter than you disarm their evolutionary threat detectors completely. The research takes us to one of the most audacious financial crimes of the 19th century to illustrate this. The Great Diamond Hoax of 1872, orchestrated by Philip Arnold and John Slack, a masterclass in exploiting superiority bias. Two rough-looking prospectors, Arnold and Slack, wander into San Francisco holding a leather bag full of raw, uncut diamonds and rubies. They claim to have stumbled upon a massive hidden gem field buried in the desolate Wyoming territory, and they don't try to sell these gems to tourists. They end up sitting across the table from some of the richest, most ruthless, most sophisticated financiers in the world, including William Ralston, the founder of the Bank of California. You would think men who built massive banking empires and railroad monopolies would be the absolute hardest people to con. They have unlimited capital. They hire the best mining engineers in the country to inspect the site. They send a bag of the gems to Charles Tiffany, the founder of Tiffany & Company in New York, to be personally appraised. The experts all verify the gems are real. The engineers visit the Wyoming site blindfolded and verify the ground is literally sparkling with jewels. Satisfied, the financiers eagerly pay Arnold and Slack roughly $700,000, an astronomical fortune at the time, to buy out their claim. And of course, the entire thing was a beautifully constructed fiction. The prospectors had traveled to London and Amsterdam, bought a sack of cheap, low-quality, industrial uncut gems, and literally salted the dirt in Wyoming, burying them just deep enough for the engineers to find. But the fascinating part of this story is not the physical mechanics of the fake mine. It is the psychological question. Why did these brilliant, deeply cynical tycoons fall for it so easily? It was entirely due to how Arnold and Slack behaved in those boardrooms. They didn't dress in nice suits. They didn't use slick, persuasive sales pitches. They acted like incredibly naive, greedy, bumbling hayseed prospectors. They played possum. They acted overly suspicious of the wealthy financiers. They pretended to be confused by the complex corporate contracts. They asked silly questions. The tycoons sat there looking at these two dusty prospectors and thought they were taking advantage of uneducated rubes. Not one person in that room believed for an instant that these two idiots were sophisticated enough to pull off a multi-million-dollar international fraud that fooled Tiffany's. Their apparent stupidity was their camouflage. When a tycoon feels infinitely superior to someone, their brain actually shuts down its critical threat detection. It is like turning off your home security system because you assume the person knocking on the door is too dumb to know how a doorknob works. By playing the sucker, Arnold and Slack stroked the ego of the tycoon so masterfully that critical thinking simply evaporated. When people feel vastly superior, their guard drops and their greed takes over. Brilliant and terrifying. But if that is how you fool a room of experts, how do you fool 1,000 people? 1,000,000? That takes us to Law 27. Play on people's need to believe to create a cult-like following. The core premise here explores an evolutionary vulnerability. People cannot endure emptiness or doubt. We have a desperate, overwhelming biological need to believe in something. It is a fundamental flaw in the human operating system. If you look at our evolutionary history, being part of a cohesive group with a shared belief system was literally a matter of survival. Isolation meant death. Because of that, humans experience profound existential dread in the absence of meaning, and if you can step into that void and offer people a grand cause, a simple cure, or a new faith, you can amass almost limitless power. And if you can step into that void and offer people a grand cause, a simple cure, or a new faith, you can amass almost limitless power. The text argues that in the modern era, in the absence of unifying grand causes, people will frantically latch onto anything that promises transformation. And the research actually breaks this mechanism down into a very specific playbook, 5 Steps of Charlatanism. As we walk through these 5 steps, I want you to think about modern parallels. Think about wellness gurus, tech evangelists, crypto influencers, fringe political figures. The playbook has not changed in centuries. Step 1. Keep it vague, keep it simple. The initial hook cannot be intellectually complex. If you explain the nuances, the caveats, and the difficult daily discipline required to actually solve a problem, you lose the crowd. You must offer massive, life-changing promises while keeping the actual mechanics incredibly vague. The language should be hazy, allowing the listener to project their own specific desires onto your message. You emphasize raw enthusiasm over rationality. It is never, here is a 10-year plan of disciplined caloric deficit and cardiovascular training. It is, buy my proprietary supplement drops to unlock your primal DNA. Step 2, emphasize the visual and the sensual over the intellectual. Boredom and quiet reflection are the enemies of the charlatan. You must fill your followers' senses with overwhelming spectacle. The research points to Franz Mesmer, the 18th century physician who claimed he could cure terrible illnesses with a mysterious force he called animal magnetism. That is actually where the word mesmerize comes from. He didn't just hand people a tincture in a sterile room. He brought them into lavish, dimly lit apartments, heavily scented with orange blossom and exotic incense. Ethereal harp music played in the background. His wealthy patients held hands in circles around massive vats of magnetized water while touching iron rods. It was a fully immersive theatrical experience. Because when you are emotionally overwhelmed by sensory input, you literally stop asking logical questions. That is the entire point. Step 3. Borrow the forms of organized religion. To solidify your power, you structure your group like a church. You create specific exclusionary rituals. You assign hierarchies, titles, and grades of purity. Then you ask for money. You demand sacrifices, almost always financial, as a test to prove devotion to the cause. Most importantly, you begin speaking with the cadence and absolute certainty of a prophet, not a businessman. This imbues your movement with a comforting, unquestionable authority that becomes very difficult for a follower to internally challenge. Step 4. Disguise your source of income. This is the paradox of the cult leader. You must appear immensely, impossibly wealthy and successful, but you can never look hungry for your followers' money. You cannot look like a salesman. Your luxury must appear to be the effortless, natural result of the truth of your methods. You surround yourself with mansions and private jets to prove to the followers that your system undeniably works. This creates a cognitive dissonance that blinds your followers to the fact that your wealth actually comes entirely from their donations and their course fees. Look at my Lamborghini. It proves my mindset trading course works, when in reality, it was the thousands of people buying the $500 course that bought the car, not the trading strategy. Step 5. Set up an us versus them dynamic. To keep the group cohesive and prevent them from questioning the dogma, you invent a shadowy enemy. The outside world is framed as corrupt, blind, jealous, or actively conspiring to destroy your movement. This builds a rigid fortress mentality. Your followers bond intensely over their shared sense of persecution and their pride in having exclusive access to the truth. It is incredibly sobering how recognizable that 5-step playbook is the moment you open social media. But let us bring it back from the macro level of cults to a tactic that operates on a more intimate, individual level. Law 31. Control the options. The psychological principle here is that the most unbreakable deceptions are the ones where your opponent genuinely feels they are making a free, autonomous choice. It is about getting others to play the game with a deck of cards you already dealt. If you give people a sense of control, they will walk into your trap willingly, and they will not blame you when it snaps shut. You force them to choose between the lesser of two evils, both of which secretly serve your ultimate purpose. You put them on the horns of a dilemma where they are hurt whichever way they turn. The research outlines a few specific methods for engineering this illusion of choice. One is called coloring the choices. Think about how a client-facing professional might present 3 design options but deliberately makes 2 of them impossibly ugly or wildly over budget just to force the client into picking the preferred design. The client feels like a powerful decision-maker calling the final shot, never realizing the menu was rigged from the start. Historically, this was a favorite tactic of Henry Kissinger when handling President Richard Nixon. Kissinger understood Nixon's psychology perfectly. He knew Nixon was notoriously insecure and deeply suspicious of his advisors. If Kissinger walked into the Oval Office and simply said, "This is the policy we must adopt," Nixon's ego would flare up. So Kissinger would present Nixon with 3 or 4 distinct options for a geopolitical crisis, but he would meticulously color them. He would frame the option he secretly preferred as the only logical, moderate, rational choice, while carefully making the other options look unhinged, extreme, or politically disastrous. Nixon felt in total control, choosing the best path forward, completely oblivious to the fact that Kissinger had corralled him into it. The second method of controlling options is called forcing the resistor, and the psychological mechanism underlying this one is wild. It draws from the work of Dr. Milton Erickson, a legendary pioneer in hypnotherapy and psychotherapy. Erickson frequently dealt with patients who possessed deep subconscious psychological resistance. These were individuals who would seem to improve in therapy, but then deliberately, almost spitefully, relapse just to subvert the doctor and prove he couldn't fix them. The secondary gain of their illness was the power it gave them over the therapist. They wanted to win therapy. So Erickson flipped the script entirely. He began prescribing the symptom. He would order these resistant patients to have a relapse. He would tell a patient struggling with anxiety to go home and deliberately try to make themselves feel as overwhelmingly anxious as possible for exactly 1 hour. He created a behavioral paradox. If the patient wants to resist the doctor's orders, they have to get better. They have to stop being anxious to prove him wrong. If they obey the doctor and have an anxiety attack, they are acknowledging his control and surrendering their rebellious resistance. By controlling the options, Erickson forced them into a psychological corner where the only way to successfully rebel against him was to cure themselves. It is an incredibly elegant application of power. You do not fight resistance head-on, which only makes it stronger. You use its own momentum against the target, much like the principles of judo or aikido. Now we are entering the final thematic stretch of today's deep dive. We have talked about manipulating others, but the ultimate and perhaps most philosophically profound application of these laws is how you manage yourself. This centers around identity, formlessness, and slaying the past. It starts with Law 25, recreate yourself. The core premise here is a radical rejection of the default roles that society attempts to force upon you from birth. Society naturally wants to categorize you. It wants to assign you a predictable, easily digestible identity. The dutiful son, the quiet employee, the reliable sidekick. Predictable people are easy to manage and control. They fit neatly into a box. But if you blindly accept that assigned role, your power is permanently capped by its inherent limitations. The text describes the refusal to accept this default identity as a Promethean act of defiance. In Greek mythology, Prometheus defied the ultimate authority of the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity, fundamentally altering human potential. In this context, a Promethean act means rebelling against the social order that is trying to keep you in a pre-labeled box. You have to treat yourself like clay. You are the artist. Your identity, your public persona, is your masterpiece. If you let your parents, your peers, or societal expectations do the molding, you have surrendered your autonomy entirely. And this act of continuous self-creation ties intimately into Law 20, do not commit to anyone. Maintaining your formlessness means maintaining your independence. The moment you permanently commit to a single faction, an inflexible alliance, or a rigidly defined identity, you lose your aura of mystery. You become predictable. You become like everyone else. The historical masterclass in this, operating at the highest possible stakes, is Queen Elizabeth I of England. She ascended to the throne in a world utterly dominated by men. The immediate crushing expectation from her advisors and parliament was that she had to marry, and quickly. To marry a foreign king would drag England into endless continental wars. To marry an English nobleman would spark a bloody civil war among rival domestic houses, and by the laws of the time, a husband would become the de facto ruler, subjugating her entirely. So what did she do? She did not outright refuse to marry, which would have provoked outrage and rebellion. Instead, she mastered the art of formlessness. She dangled the tantalizing possibility of marriage to suitors all across Europe. She played a decades-long game of intense flirting, diplomatic promises, and sudden withdrawal. She kept the entire geopolitical chessboard revolving around her. The King of Spain, the King of France, princes from Sweden, they all genuinely believed they had a chance to win her hand, and by extension England itself. So they stayed in her orbit, offering lucrative trade alliances and holding back their invading armies. She managed to prevent catastrophic wars and maintain absolute singular power over her country simply by remaining an enigma. The very moment she said, "I do," at an altar, she would have instantly lost all her geopolitical leverage. By never committing, she made herself the ultimate center of desire and diplomatic worship. She emanated mystery and desirability, never explicitly discouraging hope, but never actually yielding. Formlessness on a global scale. This concept of formlessness extends deeply into how you deal with the predecessors who came before you, which brings us to Law 41, avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. Call it the trap of succession. Human cognitive biases dictate that what comes first always appears better, more authentic, and more original. We suffer from nostalgia bias. We remember the good old days. If you are tasked with succeeding a beloved founder of a company, a famous parent, or a highly successful predecessor in any role, you are starting at a massive psychological disadvantage. You have to accomplish double what they did, because you are not just competing with their actual record, you are fighting a ghost, the idealized, romanticized memory of them. And the most common, ultimately lazy approach is to simply copy what the great predecessor did, to try on their shoes and use their exact methods. But historical circumstances never repeat themselves exactly. The economic climate changes, the culture shifts. If you try to mimic their behavior, you will always look like a pale imitator permanently lost in their shadow. The advice the text gives for this situation is brutal and uncompromising. Slay the overbearing father, disparage the legacy if necessary. Actively, intentionally, carve out a completely new and contrasting path to establish your own distinct identity. A visceral example from the research involves General Douglas MacArthur during the early days of World War II. When he arrived to take command of American forces in the Philippines, an eager assistant handed him a thick book containing all the precedents, strategies, and successful methods established by previous commanders in the region. The classic "How We Do Things Around Here" manual. Every corporate office has one. And this dynamic is not just relegated to military history. The research references a fascinating contemporary academic analysis that maps these exact laws directly onto modern corporate dominance and succession planning. It specifically examines the immense psychological and organizational burden on a new CEO taking over from a highly successful, culturally idolized founder. Think about the pressure of Tim Cook taking over Apple after Steve Jobs, or David Moyes trying to manage Manchester United after Alex Ferguson. The organizational inertia and the emotional attachment employees have to the founder's mythology can be suffocating. MacArthur looks at the book and asks the assistant how many copies exist. The assistant proudly says there are 6 copies scattered among the staff. MacArthur calmly tells him to gather all 6 copies and burn them, every single one. He openly declares that he will not be bound by the ghost of precedent and that he will make his decisions reacting solely to present circumstances, not the past. He literally burned the books to avoid stepping into a previous commander's shoes. The expectation from the board and the public is almost always the same. Just keep doing exactly what they did. Maintain the magic. Which brings us to the final thought. A lingering question to carry with you as you step away from this and back into the complex hierarchy of your own life, your own workplace, and your own relationships. But the research notes that the imitation strategy almost universally fails. The new leader lacks the founder's original context and natural charisma. If they try to be a clone, they look weak. The only way for the new leader to survive, establish true dominance, and win the loyalty of the organization is to create an entirely new vision and a radically different leadership style. They must intentionally disrupt the continuity. They must change course radically to avoid fatal comparisons to the founder. If the founder was a visionary autocrat, the successor must become a collaborative delegator. They must be formless relative to the past in order to claim the future. Now let us pull all of these threads together. We have covered an immense amount of historical and psychological ground today, and the picture that emerges of human behavior is intense. The text describes the acquisition of power as a fundamentally amoral game, amoral being the absolute key word. The laws themselves are like physics. They are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. It is a mechanism, a game of managing appearances, mastering indirect action, rigidly controlling your own emotions while systematically exploiting the emotional vulnerabilities of others. By understanding these laws, by seeing exactly how a careless word can hang you, how smoke screens hide true intentions, how physical actions effortlessly disarm logical arguments, and how deep human vulnerabilities like ego and the desperate need to believe are exploited every single day, you are forced to step out of a very naive mindset. You have to leave behind the comforting illusion that just doing the right thing, keeping your head down, and working hard automatically guarantees success and protection. You now have the map. You can see the trap doors before you step on them, but there is a profound existential warning that must accompany this knowledge. The research explicitly and repeatedly reminds us of the psychological danger of internalizing this material too deeply. When you study the cold mechanics of deception, when you learn to treat human interaction solely as a chessboard, and when you treat your own identity merely as clay to be molded for advantage, there is a very real corrosive risk to your own psychology. The greatest danger in mastering this game is losing your own soul in the process of playing it. If you are constantly wearing defensive masks, constantly managing public perception, and constantly looking for the hidden angle in every interaction, you risk forgetting who you actually are beneath the armor. You become the mask. The text warns in its own way that you must retain the ability to put the masks away when you are alone or with those you genuinely love. If this cynical performance becomes your only reality, the power you have gained will be built on a profoundly hollow, isolating foundation. You might be listening to all of this, the manipulation, the smoke screens, the cold calculation, and feeling a deep sense of revulsion. You might be thinking, I want absolutely no part of this game. It is toxic. I refuse to play. And that is a very natural, very human response to such ruthless mechanics. But consider this, in any hierarchy, the person who loudly and proudly declares they are above office politics, that they refuse to engage in the power game, is ironically making a very specific, very calculated power play. They are projecting an image of moral superiority to elevate their own status above their peers. They are still trying to win, just through a different set of rules. So ask yourself this, even in your righteous refusal to play the game, which mask have you chosen to wear?